London, 1888. The district of Whitechapel is terrorized by a series of brutal murders. 5 prostitutes were brutally murdered and mutilated. The London press gave the killer the name Jack the Ripper.
The most famous of those, the Jack the Ripper murders, a killing spree which left at least 5 women dead in the East End in 1888. Now, 137 years on from the killings, the descendants of his victims are hopeful that the truth can finally be revealed.
Jack the Ripper is one of the most famous names in true crime history. But interestingly, it's not because we know much about him. In fact, it's because we know so little that he remains such a haunting figure. He was a mysterious killer who roamed the streets of London's Whitechapel district in 1888.
London, England, July 1888. 2 months before the horrific Whitechapel killing spree began, an American named Francis Tumblety arrived in the city, although this was not his first trip to London.
His attacks were so brutal and shocking that they terrified an entire city, and his identity was never discovered. Over the years, Jack the Ripper has become more than a person. He became a symbol of fear, mystery, and the unknown. People have been fascinated by this dark figure for more than 130 years. His story has inspired countless books, movies, documentaries, and even tours around Whitechapel. But why do we keep coming back to this story? Why does the mystery of Jack the Ripper hold us so tightly, even today? The mystery resurfaces. For decades, police officers, detectives, and investigators tried to catch him, but the truth kept slipping away like smoke through their fingers. The case grew colder, yet the legend only got stronger. Then, in recent years, something remarkable happened. Modern science claimed to have cracked the case wide open. The man they named as Jack the Ripper was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who had been a suspect in Victorian times, but never proven guilty. But this leads us to big questions. Does naming someone after so many years mean the case is really closed? How reliable is the science that helped identify this suspect?
It's an age-old mystery that has gripped the world for more than a century. Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Yeah, DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
Can a piece of cloth, old and fragile, really carry DNA evidence after 130 years? And perhaps most importantly, why are we still so obsessed with a killer who lived so long ago? Why does this story keep pulling us in, generation after generation? Jack the Ripper is not just about a killer. He's a symbol of the darkest parts of human nature and society's failures. He represents fear, mystery, and unanswered questions about justice and truth. Now, as science and storytelling meet, we must ask, are we finally closing the book on this mystery, or are we just opening a new chapter? The answer is complicated. Like Jack himself, it remains elusive, hiding just out of reach, casting a long shadow over us all. After more than 130 years of silence, the mystery of Jack the Ripper suddenly burst back into the spotlight. The name Aaron Kosminski was not new. He had appeared in old police files as a possible suspect. But now, scientists claim to have real proof connecting him to the crimes. This caused a huge reaction worldwide. News outlets splashed the story across headlines, documentaries popped up, and social media buzzed with excitement and debate. Victims' families were invited to speak, sharing their feelings after so many years. For many people, this felt like the end of a long, painful story. At last, the faceless monster hiding in history had a name. It felt like justice, finally served, even if long overdue. The idea that science had pierced through the fog of time to find the killer was almost magical. It gave hope that no crime, no matter how old, could stay unsolved forever. But just as quickly, doubts and questions began to emerge. Kosminski's name was familiar to anyone who had read about the case, but nothing concrete had ever linked him to the murders before. Why did this new claim cause such a stir? What made this time different from the many failed attempts to solve the case before? The answer lies in our modern culture. Today, we are fascinated by true crime stories like never before. Podcasts, TV shows, and online forums have made cold cases part of everyday entertainment. Jack the Ripper is not just history, he's a cultural icon. People are drawn to mysteries that resist explanation. They enjoy piecing together clues and trying to solve puzzles that have baffled experts. Yet the excitement also raised concerns. How can we trust the new evidence? What if the science isn't as strong as it seems? Are we being too quick to believe a story because we want closure so badly? These questions created a lively and sometimes heated debate that continues to this day. Second, the evidence re-examined. Let's take a step back to London in 1888 to better understand how this story began. At that time, Whitechapel was one of the poorest and most crowded areas in the city. The streets were narrow and often dark, filled with the noise of people struggling to survive. Many families lived crammed into tiny rooms, and the area was known for crime and violence. For many women, especially those involved in prostitution, life was extremely difficult. They faced dangers not only from their work, but from the harsh living conditions and social stigma. It was in this tense, desperate environment that 5 women, often called the canonical victims, were brutally murdered in a few months. These women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all killed in a violent and shocking way. The attacks were savage, with wounds so deep and precise that they suggested the killer had some anatomical knowledge or skill with knives. The level of brutality stunned everyone and created a wave of fear that swept across London. Police were under enormous pressure to find the killer quickly. The public was terrified, and the newspapers eagerly reported every gruesome detail, sometimes exaggerating or adding dramatic headlines. This sensational coverage only increased panic and hysteria. Yet, despite their efforts, the police faced many challenges. For one, they lacked the technology and forensic methods that investigators have today. They relied mainly on eyewitness reports, which were often unreliable, and on following vague leads that frequently went nowhere. During the investigations, the police identified several suspects. One name that appeared repeatedly was Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel, working as a hairdresser, and struggling with mental illness. Historical records suggest he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was reportedly afraid of women. Because of his background and behavior, police saw him as a potentially dangerous person. Kosminski lived near many of the murder sites and was eventually admitted to a mental asylum. However, it is important to note that the evidence against Kosminski was very weak. There was no direct proof that he committed any of the murders. The suspicion came mainly from his proximity to the crimes and his mental health issues. Police accounts from the time described him as a possible suspect, but did not have enough evidence to arrest or formally charge him. Unlike today's investigations where DNA, fingerprints, and video surveillance play major roles, Victorian-era detectives had to work with much less. They depended on witness testimony, which was often contradictory, and on circumstantial evidence like where someone lived or who they knew. Fast forward to the 21st century, when modern science offered a new way to look at this old mystery. A piece of evidence, an old, worn shawl, came into the spotlight. The shawl was said to have been found near the body of Catherine Eddowes, one of the victims.
This silk shawl is believed to be the last piece of physical evidence left from his killing spree more than 130 years ago.
It was kept as a kind of souvenir by a police officer's family for decades. When researchers examined the shawl, they hoped it might hold clues that Victorian police couldn't have discovered. Dr. Jari Luhalainen, a molecular biologist, was part of a team that carefully tested the shawl for DNA. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is the unique genetic material found in almost every cell of our body. Modern forensic science often uses DNA to identify people from tiny traces like hair or skin cells. The scientists found mitochondrial DNA on the shawl that matched a living maternal relative of Aaron Kosminski. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mothers to their children, which means it can link a person to a family line. This match seemed to provide strong evidence that Kosminski had been near the victim and perhaps was the killer. This announcement made headlines worldwide. It seemed like the mystery might finally be solved through scientific proof, something police over a century ago could only dream about. People were excited and hopeful that at last justice could be served for the victims. But soon, experts and critics started pointing out serious issues with this new evidence. First, the shawl's origin was unclear. There was no solid proof that it belonged to Catherine Eddowes or that it was actually present at the crime scene. Over the past 130 years, the shawl had changed hands many times and had likely been handled by numerous people. This opened the door for contamination, the accidental transfer of DNA from others who touched the cloth. In forensic science, contamination can cause false matches and misleading results. Another problem was the type of DNA tested, mitochondrial DNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is unique to each person, mitochondrial DNA is shared by many relatives, sometimes hundreds or thousands of people. This means a match is not a perfect identification. It only narrows the pool of possible people. So while the DNA found on the shawl matched Kosminski's family line, it did not uniquely prove it was him. The scientific testing methods used were also criticized. Some questioned the sensitivity and reliability of the tests on such old and fragile material. The DNA might have degraded over time, making results less trustworthy. Others were concerned about the lack of transparency. Details of how the tests were done and how contamination was prevented were not fully disclosed, raising doubts about the findings. Some experts argued that the whole case might be influenced by a desire to solve the mystery rather than by hard scientific proof. The story of Jack the Ripper has captured imaginations for so long that there is a risk of letting wishful thinking guide interpretations of evidence. When science is used in a way that fits a popular narrative, it can blur the line between fact and fiction. So, while the DNA evidence on the shawl was exciting and offered new possibilities, it was far from conclusive. It opened the door for fresh debate, but also reminded us how difficult it is to rely on forensic evidence that is over a century old. Can we truly trust results when the evidence's history is uncertain and the technology, though advanced, still faces limitations? Is this discovery a breakthrough in cold case investigations, or just another chapter in a story filled with assumptions and questions? Ultimately, this re-examination of evidence shows us that science and history sometimes walk a fine line. The search for truth requires careful balance between embracing new tools and maintaining healthy skepticism. It is a reminder that mysteries like Jack the Ripper's don't always end with clear answers. Sometimes they challenge us to look deeper into what we believe, how we interpret evidence, and how much uncertainty we are willing to accept. Third truth or convenience. When the shawl's DNA results were announced, opinions split sharply. Some people embraced the news, seeing it as the final answer to a century-old mystery. Others remained skeptical and called for caution. One big issue is the type of DNA used, mitochondrial DNA. Unlike the unique DNA we often hear about, mitochondrial DNA is shared among many family members. This means the match could point to many people related to Kosminski, but not necessarily him alone. It's like trying to find someone in a huge family reunion by their last name. It narrows the field, but doesn't identify a single person for sure. The shawl's chain of custody also caused problems. Its path from the crime scene to the lab was unclear. Over so many years, it had passed through many hands, raising the possibility of contamination or mix-ups. The scientists involved in the study were also criticized for possible bias. Some had published books or made documentaries based on the theory that Kosminski was the Ripper. which could affect their objectivity. When money or reputation is involved, it's harder to be fully impartial. There's also the moral side. Kosminski died long ago, unable to defend himself. If he was innocent, naming him now damages his memory without giving him a chance to speak. If he was guilty, do we have enough proof to be certain? Can we posthumously convict someone with scientific evidence that isn't bulletproof? This debate touches on how we handle truth today. Are we willing to accept answers that feel satisfying even if they are not fully proven? Or do we demand absolute certainty? If we choose the first option, we risk rewriting history based on convenience instead of facts. Fourth, myth, memory, and meaning. Jack the Ripper is not just a man from history. Over time, he has become something much bigger, a legend that continues to captivate people all around the world. His name brings to mind images of shadowy alleys, foggy nights, and unspeakable horror. But this story goes far beyond the gruesome details of 5 tragic murders in 1888 London.
History's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper. Back in 1888, the notorious serial killer murdered and mutilated the bodies of 5 women in London.
It has grown into a cultural myth, appearing in countless books, movies, television shows, documentaries, and even tourist walking tours in London's Whitechapel district. People continue to tell and retell the story, trying to unravel the mystery, imagine new suspects, or explain the horrors in ways that make sense to them. Over the years, many suspects have been suggested as the true identity of Jack the Ripper. Some theories point to doctors, who might have had the medical knowledge to carry out such precise killings. Others speculate about nobles or members of the upper class, weaving stories of royal conspiracies and cover-ups. There are even claims about foreign spies or secret societies. None of these theories have ever been confirmed, and the mystery remains unsolved in any official sense. But the fact that so many suspects exist tells us something important. Jack the Ripper is more than a man. He is a symbol, a figure onto which people project their fears, hopes, and questions. Why does this story continue to grip us so strongly, more than a century later? The answer lies in the fact that it is about much more than just a killer. The Jack the Ripper story touches on some of the deepest and most uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. It reflects our fears about evil, how it can hide in the shadows and strike without warning. It reveals our fascination with darkness and mystery, a desire to understand the darkest parts of the world and ourselves. And it also shows how society struggles with problems like poverty, violence, inequality, and the limits of justice. The murders took place during a time of great change and chaos in London. The city was growing quickly, but that growth was uneven. Whitechapel was a poor neighborhood filled with overcrowded housing and desperate people. Many of the victims were women working as prostitutes, who were vulnerable and often ignored by the wider society. The murders exposed the city's dark side, the failure of social systems to protect the most vulnerable, the fear and suspicion that divided communities, and the sometimes harsh response of authorities struggling to maintain order. In a way, the story of Jack the Ripper is about the clash between order and chaos. The murders were a brutal rupture in society's sense of safety and control. Trying to find the killer and name him is a way to restore order. It helps us feel like we understand what happened and that we can control the story of the past. When we put a name to the horror, it becomes easier to process and less frightening. Naming the killer is a way to make sense of the senseless. But myths like this are hard to kill. Even if Aaron Kosminski was the murderer, and the evidence remains debated, the legend of Jack the Ripper will live on. This is because people love to imagine other possibilities. The story invites endless questions and interpretations. Each time someone offers a new suspect or a new theory, they are adding a layer to the myth. These stories change over time, shaped by the fears, hopes, and interests of each generation. For example, in some versions of the story, the killer is a monstrous, inhuman figure, a symbol of pure evil that exists beyond explanation. In others, he is a victim of his own mind or circumstances, a troubled man who became a monster because of society's neglect. Sometimes, the Ripper is painted as a mysterious genius, outsmarting the police and society. These different portrayals tell us more about the people creating the stories than about the killer himself. They show how the myth allows us to explore our own ideas about good and evil, justice and injustice, madness and sanity. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that we keep returning to Jack the Ripper, not because we want justice in the traditional sense, but because he allows us to explore our darkest fears safely. He is a shadow onto which we can project all our worries about violence, crime, and the unknown. His identity changes depending on what we need at the time: a monster to fear, a victim to pity, a mystery to solve. This ongoing fascination says something important about human nature. People are drawn to stories that challenge them and make them think. The Ripper legend taps into a basic human need to understand danger and evil. It also highlights how much we struggle with uncertainty. The mystery is not just about the killer's identity, but about how we face things we cannot fully explain or control. Because of this, the story of Jack the Ripper remains alive and powerful. Tourists still walk the foggy streets of Whitechapel, guided by tales of terror and mystery. Writers continue to create new novels and documentaries, exploring the story from every angle. Podcasts, films, and TV series ask the question, who was he? Again and again. This continued interest keeps the story relevant and means that every new generation has a chance to engage with it. More deeply, we return to these fog-choked streets not just to find a name or solve a crime, but to understand what this story says about us as humans. It's about our fears of the unknown, our desire for justice, and our struggle to make sense of a world that can sometimes seem cruel and chaotic. Jack the Ripper is a mirror. He reflects the darkest parts of society, but also the parts of ourselves we find difficult to face. The legend forces us to think about poverty, mental illness, violence against women, and the failures of systems meant to protect people. It challenges us to ask uncomfortable questions. Why do some people become criminals? How do societies respond to fear? How much do we really know about the past? At the same time, the Ripper myth reveals how storytelling shapes memory. The way we remember the past is not always about facts. It is often about the stories we tell ourselves to understand what happened. These stories change over time, influenced by culture, politics, and social attitudes. They can reveal more about who we are now than who the killer really was. So even if the mystery is never fully solved, the story of Jack the Ripper remains meaningful. It invites us to look beyond the surface and consider the deeper truths about humanity, justice, and fear. It is a reminder that some stories, no matter how old, continue to teach us and challenge us. In the end, Jack the Ripper is not just a name or a history lesson. He is a symbol of our ongoing struggle to understand evil and find order in a chaotic world. And as long as we keep searching, telling stories and asking questions, the legend will live on, an unsettling but powerful part of our shared human story. Now that science claims to have named Jack the Ripper, what does this really mean? Does knowing the name bring peace or more questions? Jack the Ripper was never just one man. He was a product of his time, a time of poverty, fear, and failure. Aaron Kosminski fits many parts of the story, but the real mystery is deeper than one person. This story is a mirror reflecting our obsession with evil, mystery, and justice. Why are we so drawn to killers? Why does uncertainty thrill us more than answers? Why do we keep retelling this dark history? Even with new evidence, we hesitate because the mystery is bigger than facts. It's about how we deal with fear, truth, and the unknown. In the end, we may have a name, but the story doesn't end. Jack the Ripper's shadow remains in every unsolved case and every unanswered question. Kosminski may have been Jack the Ripper, or maybe not. But the bigger question is, are we ready to let go of the myth, or has it become part of who we are? The truth has always been near, but maybe we weren't really looking for it, and that might be the most haunting part of all.